Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary Abley. I'm the pastor of All Souls Interfaith Gathering, and we are absolutely delighted to welcome you here. As you know, this event is sponsored by us, by the Pierson Library, Shelburne Farms, and the Shelburne Museum. And we are thrilled to have Fran back with us again. We've done this conversation series a number of times, and each time it gets more exciting, and I think with the Vermont authors, we're really in for a treat. Thank you, Fran.
Thank you very much, Mary. It is, I'm honored again to be a part of this conversation series. It's not typical to be given space to really think about and discuss deep issues in a public forum like this. So I am thrilled that this is happening. I also want to thank RETN. They've been here since the beginning recording these sessions so they can be made available for other people who aren't able to be here today. So the committee, made up of people from Shelburne Farms and Shelburne Museum, All Souls, and the library, came up with a real challenge of authors with differing interests and differing styles to speak about spirit, nature, and art. And even though today's theme is more about spirit, I think all three of these sessions are really going to cover probably all three of those categories, because artists and writers, I think deeply about all of those things, and writers are artists. So we all see and experience the world a bit differently. And our two writers today, in a way, I'm gonna move this down just a little bit. It seems like very loud to me. Is that okay? Better now? A little bit better. In a way, they couldn't be more different in their writing, in their exploration of the world. Marc is intellectual, literary, political. He's a novelist. Jernigan is a slice-of-life columnist who is kind of salt of the earth and concrete observer of mankind, of the human spirit. And yet both of them are champions of every man. They both, interestingly enough, when I talked to them about this, had a little bit difficult time seeing themselves as spiritual in kind of the big sense, but I think they both speak to this profoundly in their own ways, and they grapple with how spirit manifests. So this will be a very interesting conversation. A little bit about them, if you're not familiar. Marc Estrin is a noted author of 10 books, possibly 11, 12, thank you.
13 with Bread and Puppet.
And 13 with Bread and Puppet, and a memoir, that memoir. All written in the last dozen or so years, except for one that goes way back. He's also a classical cellist, social activist, and blogger. His life bio is actually also a story in which he has been a physician's assistant, Bread and Puppet circus performer, theater director, Unitarian minister, and college professor, and that list goes on. His work blends history and imagination, political, social, cultural, and religious commentary with literary experimentation. It's really interesting work. This is one of his most well-known, called Insect Dreams, and there are clearly many others. We have a couple of them outside on the table. Jernigan Pontiac, also born Fred Solomon, is a New York City transplant who has published 2 books of his essays, originally published every other week in 7 days. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with them. And before that, Vermont Times. So it's been 15, 17 years or so that you've been writing. A career cab driver, Jernigan's hacky columns are personal reflections of humanities of those lucky enough to be a passenger in his cab. That's pretty cool. So if God is in our struggle to understand the world and who we are, and/or our love and appreciation of one another, then today's talk hopefully will bear some insight. I'd like to start with the two of you becoming a writer. You both seem to have had a moment in your life that compelled you to write and the permission to become a writer. Can we start with you, Jernigan, when you had that impulse?
Sure. I also just want to begin by thanking All Souls Interfaith, all you folks from here, for inviting me. and for putting on this series. This is a beautiful, I could tell, sacred space, and I'm really honored to be a part of this, particularly to be up here with Marc and Fran Stoddard, who is not merely a younger and more attractive version of Charlie Rose, but I consider her a Vermont treasure. And I've always aspired to be interviewed by Fran so I could cross this off my bucket list now. My writing, I've always had a flair for writing, but I really didn't get into it until middle age. Really the person who kind of plucked me into this, being a writer, was Rick Kosonic, who is, some of you folks might know, he's a longtime movie reviewer on TV and in the paper in 7 Days. And he also has published for like, I don't know, 25 years, a little tabloid called Burlington Magazine. And it's really an advertising vehicle, but it's quite nice. And in the early 90s, I knew him and he said, hey, would you like to write for this little magazine? So I wrote for at least 30 or 40 of issues, monthly issues, interviewing people who are opening businesses or reviewing restaurants. And so I always say, he's the one who saw I was a writer before I did. So I always am appreciative of Rick, a great, big, friendly bear of a guy. But 7 Days, my taxi stories, my really getting into creative writing, comes out of the fact that I was like cab drivers everywhere. I was always blabbing my taxi stories to everyone I know. And at one point, a good friend of mine said, Jernigan, why don't you try writing them down? Now, he might have said it, why don't you try writing them down? You know, I'm not But either way, I took the inspiration, and I was off and running.
Thanks. And Marc, this, after many things that you've done in life, really focusing on being a writer and a novelist came later.
Well, first of all, I want to second Jernigan's thanks. I have a much worse story to tell, actually. I was a reasonable writer just from college writing, you know. And I had only written op-ed pieces. I was the coordinator of the Peace and Justice Center, so I wrote that kind of stuff. And I was a Unitarian minister, so I wrote sermons. But I'd never written fiction. In fact, I didn't think I had it in me. And I didn't start writing fiction till I was 63, something like that. And it came out of one kind of horrific event, which was that I got a phone call from a guy in New York who asked me, I live in Vermont, so I can do this, can I get him a high-powered rifle with a telescopic sight? And I said, well, why do you want this? And he said, because I want to kill black people out my window. He lives in a project in the Bronx, a housing project. And I said, well, why do you want to kill black people? And he said, because there's going to be a war between the blacks and the Jews, and I want to take some with me, and any cops that would try to stop me. So I refused him, and he told me I was an asshole, and you know, I didn't know anything about reality. And we didn't really speak after that. But I wrote this conversation down because it was so extraordinary. And having written it down, I just sort of tried to play with this character. Who would say such a thing? Who would think of such a thing? And then all of a sudden, my wife tells me I'm a maniac attractor. You know, a lot of other maniacs came to mind, except the other maniacs aren't as terrible as this maniac. And, you know, they're funny, and they're people who believe in the doctrine of excess. And so I started rolling stories that I know about this guy in with stories from other people. And I had 100 pages of typed stuff, and I said, 100 pages? This is a novel. I'm writing a novel. And that's how it started. And that book was not the first book published, but is my book called Golem Song, about a guy who wants to become a golem and save the Jewish community from a pogrom. And
Great. Thank you, Mark. Now, both of you are originally from New York. What makes Vermont now your home? What was it about coming here that really made you stay? I assume this is your home now. Mark?
I came with the hippie invasion in the 70s, or actually 69. I came to teach at Goddard College, was invited when the new president came, and I taught at Goddard for 10 years, and it was sort of the most creative 10 years of my life, absolutely fabulous. And I was a Vermonter by then, you know, and by the end of that. So
there you go.
Yeah.
I came up here in '75 to visit my older sister, who was part of the hippie invasion. She stayed. And I met a woman who became my wife, and I fell in love with her, and I fell in love with Vermont. I felt like this was home, and I feel to be extraordinarily lucky to find a place that so resonates with my spirit. And I never take that for granted. I love this place.
So back to, what about spiritual influences when you were growing up? Jernigan, you want to?
Both of I grew up in an entirely secular home. Both of my parents were atheists. But there is an element of my childhood that bears directly on the writing I do, which I could speak about, which is I grew up in my childhood, which just the fate that was given me, my karma, if you want to use that word, was filled with a lot of abuse, a lot of trauma. And I didn't have people in my world who were really tuned into me, were really seeing my spirit, who were really looking out for me. And I think because of that, I was exceptionally attuned to the rare moments of grace and kindness and compassion that I saw in my childhood and coming into adulthood. I was like in a parched desert, and I needed the water. And I know that's directly where my writing comes out of. What's the propulsion for my writing and what's the inspiration for my writing, is that I'm especially in tune to the simple human kindnesses and connection between people, those moments of grace that happen all the time if you're paying attention. So I think that's continues to fuel my writing.
Great. And Mark, your spiritual influences
Well, I
growing up?
grew up in the Bronx in a less than religious, less than yours. I was a red diaper baby. My parents were commies. I was the only kid on the block that wasn't bar mitzvahed. And consequently, I never learned to speak Hebrew. And so my parents thought religion was superstitious nonsense, and I began as a scientist. I was a chemistry major in college, PhD student at the Rockefeller University in microbiology, so there wasn't much room for that. But when I made the switch over into theater, I began to see larger issues that contain, I think one could say, being able to see what spirituality meant. And also in the 60s, everybody was doing the I Ching and, yoga and all of that. Well, that wasn't ridiculous. There was a lot of stuff that even a red diaper baby could appreciate. So that's, I think, where it came from, a lot of friction. Right?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe if we use this microphone that's standing for Mark.
I can talk more into that.
Okay.
Instead of talking to the audience.
Are we doing okay, audio-wise, more or less?
Bring it closer, because we're having trouble hearing.
You are from that side? Okay. What's interesting, just to follow up, Mark, is once you started writing, you were kind of labeled as a Jewish writer. How did that affect you?
Well, it was very peculiar. I wrote, the first book that was published was this book, Insect Dreams, I stole Kafka's, the guy who turns into a cockroach, and Gregor Samsa. I stole him, and I turned him 180 degrees because Kafka kills him off in the space of a short story. And so I wrote this rather long book about Gregor coming to America and living through American history in detail from 1920 to 1945. And then there were a lot of great reviews of this book, and one of them said, "Oh, we have a new Jewish writer." And the only thing Jewish about that is that Gregor was a Jewish cockroach, probably. So I thought, what are they getting at? What is this Jewish writer stuff? So the next two books that I wrote were my exploration of what it means to be a Jewish writer, if I was a Jewish writer. And it turns out I'm a Jewish writer.
So since this is our theme, just to kind of hit right on it, what does the word spirit evoke for you? And does it influence your writing in any way? Jernigan.
That's a deep question. About, I think it was a little over a month ago, I ran into Mark in the locker room of the YMCA in Winooski. He was going, I was coming. And we looked at each other and said, we kind of knew each other, and said, "Oh wow, we're doing this thing together. And it's going to be about spirit." Like, both said, "Why were you invited?" I said, "I don't know, why were you invited?" But I said, in the course of our little chat, I said, well, if there's anything to do with spirit in my writing, it's got to be between the lines. It's not in the lines. Mark nodded. And then he went on his way, and then I went up and I went on the treadmill, and I'm on the treadmill, which faces the windows, and I see Mark go to his car, and then he stops and he comes back in, and he comes up to me on the treadmill, and he goes, "That thing you said about between the lines, that was good. You should say that when we have it." So I'm saying it.
I'm glad I gave you the opportunity.
Yeah. But, I think what I mean by that is that when dealing with spirit, with all consciousness, with God, with the divine, what is there? They're saying there's 40 different names of God, but one God. But when dealing with that subject, you're necessarily dealing with the ineffable. You're dealing with something that cannot really be directly put into words. It's the province of artists and mystics and maybe writers sometime. But it's certainly at the heart of behind the stories I tell.
And what's your take on that question about what does that word evoke?
Being on this panel is sort of like being accused of being a Jewish writer. But I haven't really thought of myself as a spiritual writer, and now I have to think about it.
And spiritual issues are embedded in your work.
Absolutely.
All of your characters
And
explore it. You are
that's right.
deeply
And
knowledgeable.
so the first thing I did was go back and review what books have I written. I made a list, and I thought, what's the spiritual? What strikes me actually driving down today is the first line of the Tao Te Ching, which is that which the path that can be told is not the true path. And that's essentially what Jernigan is saying, is that it's not only between the lines, it simply cannot be uttered. And I believe that. And there are particular artworks in my life that illustrate that. And one that just, is immediately and very strong is Mahler's late song cycle, Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth. And the first song in that piece has a refrain that goes, Dunkel ist das Leben, ist der Tod. Dark is life, dark is death.
Well, I'll get to that later. Let's do some reading. I I assume that all of you have probably heard a little bit, but I've got authors here. They've got to read a little bit of their work, so you get a flavor of it. So I hope, Jernigan, you might begin with your pieces from two stories, a little bit from George and a little bit from Good Time Charlie Gets the Blues.
Sure.
You know, I do. It's a good thing I did, huh? Here you go.
I don't have my 453 stories memorized. This is from a very early story called George. And this is a landmark story for me because I really let myself express my deepest feelings in this story. And I kind of let go of worrying about what people are going to think about it. What somebody told me, what somebody thinks about you is none of your business. And I just realized that the ticket for being a writer that gets punched is you have to say that your deepest truth and let the chips fall where they may, right? So this is a story about a guy I drove for years and years who was a dishwasher at a ski resort in southern Vermont, and he would come up and live it up on the weekends. He had a very set routine, the same every single weekend. And went to this restaurant, but I really liked the guy. So I wrote, sometimes I believe that among us walk a few special souls. I like to think of them as the bearers of the fairy dust, seemingly devoid of ulterior motive, and always without public notice. These folks go through life with no off switch on love. They're not saints by any means. They may harbor deep tragedy, and their personal lives may reveal the occasional ethical shortcoming, but somehow, in their wake, good cheer and joy abound. Without these souls, the world is a sad and arid place, perhaps even uninhabitable. And then this other little clip of a story is from Good Time Charlie's Got the Blues. In the rearview mirror, which is where I see everything, I watched Charlie pull the tarnished silver instrument from his hip pocket, cradle it in both hands, and move it up to his mouth. He began playing, and never had I heard a more beautiful, mournful sound. He was simply riffing on a blues scale, but the soulfulness nearly brought tears to my eyes. The guy was a virtuoso. I reeled from the chasm-like gap between his playing and speaking. Although he projected a friendly, optimistic air, talking Charlie was hesitant, tentative and unsure of what he was trying to say. His ideas and feelings emerged convoluted. Playing Charlie was perfectly articulate, poetically expressive. On the harp, the guy was Shakespeare. It occurred to me that this is a sterling example of the inherent folly of snap judgments. Maybe everyone harbors hidden magic if you just give them the chance and you're willing to experience it.
You know, it seems that you really find the best in everyone that you meet. I mean, you have questions about people, and you know when people are in trouble. Does it reflect a belief that human nature is a reflection of the divine in any way, or are you not thinking on those terms?
Well, when I'm driving, I'm thinking about getting people safely home, because that's my job. But I guess the best way to explain how I think about it is the notion of, well, among our Indian brothers and sisters, their favorite greeting, the way they greet one another, is namaste, namaste. And it comes from the Sanskrit, and it means, as best I can understand it, the spirit or the soul in me acknowledges the soul in you. And kind of a lifelong journey that I'm on, or goal, or however I could put it, is I'm trying to meet people on that level. And to me, it's not so much meeting the best, it's the reality. I think all the things that are in the way, all of our envies and jealousies and resentments and hatred and all of that stuff, that's just window dressing. That's stuff we're here to get through. So I feel that if I could do my best to meet people on the true level, the level of what could be called the soul, on that level as best I can, then I'm being really in reality, and I'm really, truly meeting people. This is a journey. This is not something, this is a lifelong practice.
Thank you. What really moves me about both of you is how powerful story is. Of course it is for writers. And Marc, you have a story that you chose to read that is incredibly powerful. And I'd like to talk about story and the power of story, but do you want to go ahead and read
Sure.
from Julius?
You're really blessed as a writer to be able to immediately dialogue with your readers or audience or listener. And I can't do that, and consequently I don't have to get anybody home safe. So, that's the difference between our writing. This is the part of the fifth question and very short last question in a series of infrequently asked questions about Coney Island at the end of the Lamentations of Julius Marantz.
Copies of which are right
Oh yeah,
near the door.
I thought you might like to see the earlier infrequently asked questions. Yeah, Laura. Whoops.
Oh, that's why that might not be working.
Just happened.
Oh, okay.
I can project without it.
Well, we have a few more questions, and then of course you can be thinking of your questions. We will have a Q&A before the hour's up.
This fourth infrequently asked question about who's come to Coney Island is, and what about Edison? Did he come too? I want to draw to your attention before I read this a quote from Edison. He says, "Until we stop harming all other living beings, we are still savages." At last, a Native American. Yes, he came. 8 years before Freud he came, accompanied by Westinghouse and Faraday and Adam Smith and Death. They came to electrocute an elephant. 44 years before Julius was born, they came to electrocute an elephant named Topsy. Elephants, the highest form of animals, symbols of strength and astuteness, emblems of wisdom, of eternity, of moderation and pity, removers of obstacles, charismatic beasts suggesting the power of Buddha, miraculous aspiration, analysis, intention, and effort. Their trunks are capable of both uprooting trees and picking the smallest leaves, thus suggesting that humans develop their powers in both the gross and the spiritual worlds. Massive and gray, they resemble dark clouds of refreshing rain. Indra's mighty elephant digs with its tusks and reaches its trunk deep into the earth, sucking up water and spraying it into clouds which bring forth rain. Elephants thus link the heaven above with the tonic below and symbolize the mist that separates formed worlds from the unformed. Their tusks, both digging tools and weapons, linking the beast again to things supra and subterranean. Elephants were named for their tusks, for Elephas, the Greek for ivory. Achilles' sword in Pope's Homer had a handle with steel and polished elephant adorned. They are loyal and affectionate, the elephants. Older calves help younger siblings, adults their sick or wounded comrades. They demonstrate ideals. It is said that mothers of great masters will dream of elephants at birth. Most easily trained of all the beasts, they rarely forget, and when their great patience is exhausted, they have a remarkable memory for wrongs done them, and many stories are told of elephant revenge. Mice, do not scare them. Topsy was 30 and weighed 3 tons. She began as a worker, hauling the beams and blocks that became the island. When the parks were built, she turned entertainer, doing tricks in pink tutu for gawking faces. Toward the end, she became quite blind, having worn her eyes out looking at America and seeing nothing. But she did see the drunken trainer who put his cigarette out against her tongue and laughed. She picked him up, threw him against the wall, then smashed his head quite easily underfoot. And thus she became a rogue, a man-killer, and her sentence was death. Topsy was given a bale of carrots laced with cyanide and scarfed them down without effect. Another helping, please? The park owners saw a chance to be tough on crime and also make a profit. For every scratch and itch, they announced that the murderous rogue elephant would be publicly hanged. No, 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 cried the ASPCA, too cruel and inhuman. No, no, cried Thomas Alva Edison. Hadn't New York State just replaced the gallows with a new humane electric chair? I'll come and help. There was more to this than met the eye. In Topsy time, the Wizard of Menlo Park was engaged in his own death struggle with George Westinghouse for control of America's electrical infrastructure. His direct current system, he claimed, was safe, while Westinghouse's was deadly. To prove it, he'd been publicly electrocuting cats and dogs for years. It was he who convinced the state to use Westinghouse's alternating current for its electric chair. So much and no more had he accomplished, an electrocuted criminal was widely referred to as being Westinghoused. So what an irresistible photo op was here. How better to demonstrate the danger of his rival's system than to roast a full-grown elephant? Dr. Edison brought a team of technicians and a film crew. On the 4th of July, 1903, before a cheering patriotic crowd of thousands, Topsy was led to a special platform. The cameras rolled, and the switch to Coney Island's powerful electrical plant was thrown. Topsy's short-lived hell on earth lasted only 10 seconds, at 6,000 volts. She convulsed, her hide began to smoke, and she collapsed. Applause. It's a take. The great man showed the film to audiences across the nation to win his point, if not his contracts, and to help forge the created non-conscience of the race. Intrepid readers may watch this 15-second film, that's you, in the privacy of their own hearts. Just Google Topsy electrocution. George Orwell had warned Julius some time ago. We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of civilized men. For Hegel, the Enlightenment meant a struggle between reason and what he called the night of the world. That chaotic mix of hatred and irrationality which can destroy humanity and what it builds, but which is paradoxically the source of its enormous energy. For Hegel, human history revolves around the attempt to negate the negativity of the night of the world and turn it to productive thought and action. He would have liked to have said, where there is id, there shall be ego. 5, final question. What tense do you want to live in? I want to live in the imperative of the future passive participle, in the what ought to be.
Thank you, Mark. So you did an interesting thing. So here's this story that's very powerful, and your very sharp mind on a philosophical thought. What is it about story, parable, whatever, that gives a bigger punch, or might not, than nonfiction or opinion or historical fact? Jernigan, thoughts about that?
Well, my stories, both taxing and otherwise, are almost entirely nonfiction. To this day, people come to readings I do and go, "Are you really a cab driver?" And I answer, my imagination is not that good. But I think, stories is, right, since we were cavemen, right now we're hanging around the fire talking to each other. So I think that'll always be part of human existence. I always felt, as a writer, I have a very meager means of communicating. I always thought, I kind of envy musicians and dancers, particularly dancers, their actual body, and artists. It's much more of, I think, talking about the ineffable, talking about the spirit, talking about what you're trying to express. Words are so meager, but it's what I got, so I do my best.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that you do write stories about what's right in front of you, what you see and experience every day. And Marc, you write stories that your characters are created, or they're more imagined through history. Where do you come down about story and its power? Because you come from a more
Well,
creative.
I come from a nonfiction background that is science. A lot of scientific theory is fiction, but it's disprovable, and you go on to the next. So you approach nonfiction, doing science, starting with fiction. But it's always struck me that if you want to read the truth about things, you should go to the fiction section of the library, because books from even 1950 are out of date. Nonfiction books, history books, books about politics. And yet, if you want to read the truth, you can read Madame Bovary, or you can read the Brothers Karamazov, or you can read Don Quixote in the 16th century, or Homer. So that stuff doesn't go out of print because it's always relevant. So what does that mean? It means that's more truthful than what nonfiction people write. So,
Okay. When do you know you have a really good story? Marc?
Well, for me, people who take my cab and know I'm a writer and know I have this strange little side thing that I do, and that's a very small percentage of the people who take my cab. There are two camps. Either, you better not write about this, or what do I have to do to get written about? So those are my two. But I drive hundreds of people, and I create 2 new stories a month. So it's a very small sliver of my interactions become stories. And they all spring from the same place, which is something about a fare, something about the situation of the person or what happened in the taxi moved me. I want to say emotionally, not so much on a thinking level, but moved my heart in some way.
Or tested you.
Or tested me. And that's always a big part of some of the stories. And sometimes when I sit down to write, I don't even know exactly what that jewel or that kernel was. But I know if I just hang on to it, it'll reveal itself as the story is written. Sometimes I'm surprised what the story turns out to be about. And sometimes I have to wait, in certain cases, years before I understand how to write the story. So luckily, with my increasingly middle-aged brain, I have notes, or else I'd be lost.
And thank you. Mark, when do you know there's a kernel of a story or a character's
Well,
beginning to come
I
along?
write mostly comic novels. This is even a comic novel in the whole. So my stories usually start with a stupid little idea that seems funny to me. Like I wrote this really big book, the second of my What Does It Mean to Be Jewish book, called The Education of Arnold Hitler. Mm-hmm. And I just had this idea, it would be really funny if your name was Arnold Hitler. You know, and that's it. And I turned to my wife, we're driving up to Bread and Puppet, and I said, what do you think? It would be funny, wouldn't it? She said, yes. That was it. And I started writing about this wonderful guy, just sweet, terrific guy, smart, competent, with this really terrible name. And what would happen to somebody like that, where the label. So that's a kind of, that's an example of a stupid little idea that got turned into 400 pages. And the thing is, I never know what the hell I'm going to be writing about or what it is. I grab onto an idea, and it either has legs or it doesn't. And I don't know who the characters are. Usually I don't know what happens. The novel I'm working on now, I have no idea how it ends. I assume the characters will tell me what they want done. And a lot of writers say that they don't write, the characters write through them. And that's absolutely the case. I mean, I can't write. I don't know anything about it. But I can grasp onto a character and listen. I'm a musician.
Well, actually, that was my next question, and then I will turn it over to you, I promise. I've got more, but I'm interested in listening. For both of you, I think, Mark, you as a musician, I have that here, just you have a unique ear, and you're, of course, listening to your fares and what's going on. Talk to me about listening and how that affects your writing. You want to start, Mark?
Well, sometimes, somebody says something and you got to write that down and use it, somehow. Find a character that can say that, because it's a terrific thing to say. But it's not often like that. It's listening to the text both in large and in small. And I'm also doing some editing of other people's work, and I listen very carefully to the rhythm of their sentences and to the rhythm of their textual structure. And that's, I sort of sub-vocalize as I read my own stuff, and so there's a lot of listening. And in fact, I discovered too late that I should never read any of my books. In fact, I should never allow them to be published until I have read them aloud. And in the more recent books, I've not gone to print without doing that.
Jernigan, any other thoughts?
Listening? Mm-hmm. I'm still learning how to listen. Again, I would say that I am not thinking about writing when I'm in the cab. Mm. It's enough to be listening to the Red Sox game and eating a sandwich and trying to get the people home safe. That's it's still a work in progress for me to really listen. My approach to cab driving, every cab driver has their own approach. Some think that you, the fare, are their therapist, and they're going through some kind of self-catharsis with each fare. I'm not kidding, there are cab drivers like that. My approach is always whatever direction they want to go. I will talk about, if the person wants to talk, everything from the weather, the ultimate Vermont subject, to the existence of God. So I'll go wherever they want to go. I'm usually open for it. Sometimes I have to admit, I have somebody who just seems really interesting, and I almost feel like, oh wow, I could get a story out of this. I got to pump them for more. But I hold myself back, so it's only after the fact, on reflection on it, that the story evolves. But listening is to really listen, to people, what I'm working on in my life from a heart level, not from a head level. I think that's a part of a lifelong journey for me.
I just want to comment on that. You introduced me and my books as being intellectual. I always find that an insult. But I find it very difficult to make the distinction that you make, a heart level and not on a head level. It seems to me that this is part of an organism. They're deeply connected. The Chinese character, there's a Chinese character for heart-mind, and I often use the word heart-mind in my writing because I just don't see the separation. And I don't like to be accused of it.
Well, there is, I guess, scholarly. I mean, you have such deep knowledge, and you use it in your books.
So?
Well, that's just a description. So I do have more, but I'd like to see if are there some burning questions from folks that came out today to see, meet, or hear Marc and Jernigan.
They don't even have to be burning.
Yes.
Both of you have mentioned music, and I used to tell someone if they didn't believe, all they had to do was, now it would be a choice of music. Some would say Mahler, but I always said, how can you listen to the Messiah and not believe in something that moved that person to write such incredible music? And so I was interested that you both mentioned music, but I'm sure people could say the same thing about an incredible work of art. So what outside forces, other than the human contacts you have, what are the things in art and music and objects? And then I think the big one is nature. Mm-hmm. Because people have said to me, oh, I believe in God, but I just spell him differently, N-A-T-U-R-E. So nature, art, music, I know that's a big question, but I'd like you to respond to that. Movable forces around you that are perhaps not the written word.
So what I'm getting to, just repeat this for the video, is what outside forces, what from art, from nature, have brought spirit, or that place between the lines for you? Marc?
Music is by far the most important input to me. I spend a lot of time playing cello in symphony orchestras, and I spend a lot of time singing in choruses. Messiah is a hugely favorite piece of mine, and I've written several books about Messiah. I try to, in every book, tackle as a writer, trying to describe a piece of music that is very deeply important to me. And it's extremely difficult, but it's a challenge that, okay, so what's the piece of music that's going into this book? The piece or several pieces. So I completely agree with you that music is an external dimension that becomes internal to an amazing degree that swells up to much larger than your flesh container.
Yeah, sometimes when, and I've been doing this so long, it doesn't happen often, but I just get stuck in the writing. I just can't find my way into it. Usually it happens just by chance, because I'm driving so much, the radio's on all the time. I'll hear something. Could be by Bonnie Raitt, it could be by Jackson Browne, it could be by Bruce Cockburn. Mostly it's the singer-songwriters. I'm a baby boomer, right? And it'll just cut through to the heart. And then all of a sudden, I'll get all kinds of wonderful thoughts about how to approach the story. Or I'll see a movie. It could be a Hallmark movie. I love girly movies. They move me. As I think I mentioned before, it's sometimes these other realms of music, art, and creativity that cuts through and connects us with our spirit, for sure.
Another question, yes.
I just wonder, to what extent do you agonize over the right words, work to find the beauty of what it is you want to say in words. You can express it maybe in music or other ways, but and verbally perhaps, but to get the right wording. I'd just be interested to hear what that process is like for each of you.
This is a question about the struggle of writing itself and finding the right words to express what you need to express.
Well, we publish quite a few poets, and they're still working on their books way after they're published, and on their poems. It's amazing to me, because when you write a 400-page novel, you can't work at that level, where you go over, well, you can if you're Flaubert, or maybe Flaubert didn't have to do it much, even though he said he did it. But you cannot take the care with every sentence, every choice of word, every rhythmical pattern that you would if you're writing a poem, or even a short story. And so I think a lot of novelists have to have kind of natural ears so that even the first draft is pretty good. The only time I've ever done what you're suggesting, I have a book that's coming out this month probably, about Tchaikovsky's corpse. It's an interior monologue of Tchaikovsky's corpse as he's lying in his coffin. And I had to establish in the opening pages that he was dead, that he looks up and sees the stars through the ceiling, because I knew that the first beat was he wanted to talk to Beethoven, who was writing about the Vater, unser Vater, beyond the stars in Beethoven's Ninth, in the Ninth Symphony. And I couldn't get it right. And I must have written those few pages 30 or 40 times, which is very, very strange for me. I don't do that. But I just couldn't get it right, so it didn't sound weird, so it didn't sound forced. So. But I don't have a lot of experience doing that kind of detail that poets have.
Finding the right words. To me, it's entirely a matter of trusting myself, trusting what's coming through. That's the entire process. So I've gotten much more efficient in my writing because when I sit down, I don't know what it is, something clicks and I open up to a certain space. Because, and Marc alluded to this before, for me, the words come through me. Sounds mystical, doesn't it? Maybe it is mystical. But they come through me. And often if I want to change a word, I'll change it and try this. I'll go to the thesaurus and I'll come back to the word that my subconscious, unconscious, spirit, soul threw up there to begin with. And it's the right word. So that's how I look at writing. It's ignoring the voice on the side that's going, what, are you kidding me? You have absolutely nothing worthwhile to say. And you have to go, okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing. And then just completely, and just trusting that process, which the longer I do it, the more I trust it.
Because it's getting near 4, I'm going to ask, I've just one question for each of these guys that I do want to ask, and then I'll just check in with you and see if people are up for another 5 minutes or we're good. So the question for you, Marc, a lot of your, as much as they are comedies, there's a lot of darkness in your books as well, and a critique of our culture. And a couple of main characters commit suicide in the end as a response to the world's state of affairs. Where for you is hope, possibility, salvation, or does that come into your picture? You're still here. That's good.
I am. I don't know the answer. I personally feel pretty pessimistic about what's going on. One of the great moments in seminary when I went to Starr King, which is a UU seminary in Berkeley, I was sitting talking to the president. It was very, a small group, very interpersonal. And he said, Marc, the difference between a religious approach and the approach of a political activist, went to seminary as a political activist, is that for a religious consciousness, there is always the possibility of redemption. And I don't think I ever made it past being a political activist, because, you know, it's very hard for me to see how any of this stuff on many levels can be redeemed from the spider web of greed and stupidity and that has been spun around us. I did have a moment at the end of Arnold Hitler. Actually, Arnold Hitler was one of the bleakest books. It started with a burned corpse on the sidewalk, and some kids come along and look at it and say, what happened? His arms chained behind his back. There's a gas can next to him. And then the book became, who is this guy? How did he get here? And I got to the end of this, and I was reading Dickens' Jag. I'd never read Dickens. Amazing, but he completely blew my mind. And I'm getting to the end of Arnold, where he's going to be attacked by some neo-Nazis in the Bronx and burned. And I had this wonderful description from Hitler's the description of Hitler's corpse after being burned. Irony. And because Arnold was anything but a Nazi, even though his name was Hitler, right? So I said, Mark, you're so mean to your characters. Why don't you be like Dickens? Dickens was always, even the most terrible people in Dickens, he's very generous too. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write a happy ending. It was a big assignment, but I'm glad I did it. And I got to bring back all the characters, and I got to think of other things that they did, and it was very nice. And it's even believable because it's only a semi-happy ending.
So these are all teases to read this great stuff. So Jernigan, for you, I'm going to actually read back to you something that you wrote. Extended substance abuse does a number on the human core. I've heard the phrase soul murder used in this regard, but I don't buy it. I don't believe the soul can be killed, but it sure as hell can be hijacked and held hostage. I'm just wondering what gives you such belief in the soul.
Well, I don't know. That's a profound question, and I don't know where it comes from in me. Who knows? But you know, in hearing that passage, it reminds me of there was a guy who wrote books about issues of soul and spirit. I think his heyday was like the 80s and the 90s. I think his name was Gary Karpov or something like that. And he wrote a book that was quite famous back then called The Seat of the Soul. And I don't remember a whole lot from the book, but I do remember that has stuck with me is that he called this plane of existence where we're all meeting right now, he called it Earth School. And that's kind of has stuck with me. I think that, I mean, the way I think about, you know, my feeling or sense of the divine or God or whatever word we want to use for it is like an ocean. And we're all like drops of that ocean trying to get back. I think of a song by Jackson Browne where he sings, it was an early song, it was almost a gospel song, and he sings, "Rock me on the water, sister, will you soothe my fevered brow? Rock me on the water, we'll get back to the sea somehow." So I guess my sense of spirituality is basically the movie Finding Nemo.
Thomas Pynchon calls this space, in his new book that just came out, he calls this space that we're in meat space, as in carnivores. Neat space, as opposed to cyberspace. Neat
Wow.
space.
Okay. We can close now, but, if there's one or two more burning questions, I think we're okay with that? Okay? Yes.
This is a question for Mark. You talked about how now you wouldn't publish a book without reading it out loud, and it made me wonder, when you do that, what are you looking for or
I'm
picking
listening.
up on?
I'm listening. I have some books that I think pages are terrific, but when you read them out loud, they don't work, right?
And you go back
No, yes or no. I mean, it doesn't have, for instance, there's a page, you have it in your thing, where Dante comes to Coney Island, and the Coney Island burns down, in hell. And there's a little poem in space of all the attractions that, but you can't read that. It doesn't read. It looks great on the page, it looks great to the eye. So sometimes you want to change it so it can be readable, and sometimes it's not a to be read out loud thing, it's a print thing.
Anything else? If you hadn't noticed, Marc has a publishing company, so he's also publishing some books. Do you want to just address that quickly?
Well, my wife and I started with a gag. Out on the table, I think, is a copy of The Annotated Nose. Well, The Annotated Nose is a fictive book, and there's a fictive character that makes fictive commentary on the annotations on the nose. So I needed a publishing company to publish, a fictive publishing company to publish this fictive book. So we thought we'd call, in the book, I thought I'd call it Fomite. My daughter's a doc, and she told me, okay, a fomite is a surface on which microorganisms get transferred from one person to another, like, a doorknob, a stethoscope, doctor's tie leaning over different patients. That's a fomite. And it struck me that a book was like a fomite, for ideas and thoughts and whatever. So we made, as a joke, in The Annotated Nose, which is out there, Fomite Press. And then I go to some readings and we hear things, people reading stuff that's terrific. And I kept saying, this should be published, that should be published, that should be published. And nobody would publish it because it's too good, it's too, what I mean is it doesn't fit the dimensions of what publishers are looking for right now. And so I just thought, well, why don't we try it? There's all these new technologies out there. So we did one book. And we thought, there's a guy that gave us his manuscript, and my wife researched all the different publishing things, POD publishing. And we came up with a system, and the book came back, and it looked wonderful. It looked like a real book. It handled like a real book. And we thought, okay, well, we'll try this. So the end of this month will be 3 years, and we now have, we will have by the end of this month 50 books out by 37 different authors, not me.
I thought that was important too. We'll probably talk more about publishing over the next 2 Wednesdays. So
I'm happy to come and tell you our experience with this system. And my wife is even better because she does all the tech stuff and business stuff.
thank you. Thank you both, Jernigan and Marc Estrin. And it's been a wonderful conversation. I, of course, never get through all my questions. There are plenty more to ask, but thank you for taking us to kind of another place today. I also want to thank, of course, RETN, Shelburne Farms, Shelburne Museum, Shelburne Library, and All Souls for putting these conversations on. Next week, we'll explore nature and writing for both adults and young readers and children with Marian Nagley and Natalie Kinsey-Warnock. So I hope you let people know about this and join us again next Wednesday at 4. Thank you so much.